Time now for another episode of How Is This a Thing? And boy, do we have a lot to get through today. We begin with this article from Bloomberg. Liverpool's mass COVID testing could be a game changer. Boris Johnson's claims about antigen tests aren't entirely hype, but they need to be folded into a stronger program of contact tracing and isolation. As Carl Vernon recently pointed out, it looks like Liverpool is being targeted first in the UK because it may be considered the toughest nut to crack. Perhaps Liverpudlians are considered likely to provide the greatest resistance to the authoritarian measures in the UK. Though testing is not mandatory per se, not yet anyway, it is nevertheless a first step in making it so. And as we've already seen in Slovakia, where testing is mandatory, the plan could be to make it so that people have to self-isolate for a period of time if they refuse the test, or if they produce a positive PCR test regardless as to whether they have symptoms or not. Once again, healthy people being placed under house arrest. Ultimately, the virus situation is not meant to be gotten under control. None of the so-called control measures like social distancing, reducing personal contacts, working from home, mandatory masks, washing of hands, closing businesses, €9 meals in pubs, time limits in pubs, curfews. None of these things have stopped European nations from going back into second lockdowns, and they weren't supposed to. As anyone who has done an iota of research into the Great Reset and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, what you should know by now is that the Great Reset is about resetting humanity's expectations on every aspect of our lives: the economy, the social contract, how we work, how we communicate, how we socialize, our standard of living. The restrictions and lockdowns are actually simply excuses to restrict human freedom, such that people become gradually conditioned into living under the new abnormal. And of course, these measures just so happen to serve the interests of the climate agenda. Lockdowns and reduction of human movement, that was an excuse to redesign our cities, for example, expand walkways, public transport routes, and allegedly reduce humanity's carbon footprint globally. And unless people wake up to all of these lockdowns being nothing more than a Trojan horse for the climate change agenda, don't expect anything to go back to normal anytime soon. In order to meet the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the world must reduce its carbon footprint by 7.6% year on year by 2030. So life is never supposed to return to anything approaching normality. And Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum makes that very clear when he talks about life after the Great Reset.
We do not want to do just patchwork on our old system. It's not enough to change a few policies to address short-term issues. What we need is a change of mindsets. It came out in the discussion of business models, of lifestyles, in order to achieve a more cohesive, more collaborative, more resilient world. It must be a comprehensive approach to shape the future, integrating all organizations and people with innovative ideas.
Also notice how there's no time limit given by governments on when mask mandates are supposed to end or when social distancing is supposed to be phased out, because they're not supposed to be phased out. The public, who have been hoodwinked into believing that the vaccine will be the magic bullet solution, just infer that life will return to normal someday after the vaccine, but that's not supposed to be the case. And the public will be in for a very rude awakening if they think that social distancing and masks are supposed to end after the vaccine has been widely administered. Social distancing and the banning of protests, as they've done in the UK, where 2 or more people cannot gather together on the street, is simply about quashing dissent. Because if all of humanity was to rise, the globalists behind this power grab would be defeated very, very quickly. They want to keep humanity atomized, divided, hemmed in, living in isolation and fear of each other in order to prevent revolution. You were told it was just for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. 8 months later, your rights still haven't been returned to you. And there's no real end in sight, is there? Ask yourself, outside of the mainstream media, the television, newspapers, radio, the social distancing signs, warnings on motorways, would you even know from your own personal experience that you've been living in a pandemic? Who told you to shut down your business, for example? Was it really necessary? To all the pub owners out there, the restaurant owners, and other SMEs, I don't know what you're doing right now or why you haven't twigged that you've been conned, and why you haven't taken a case yet against the government. Did you shut down your business because a customer walked into your premises one day during the height of the so-called pandemic, and they were coughing and sneezing, and then a few days later, one of your staff got sick, and then one by one, more and more of them were bedridden at home, unable to come to work. And then they started calling you, telling you that their parents or grandparents also contracted the virus as it spread further and further through the community, and now their elderly loved ones are in ICUs in hospital. Did that happen? Did they tell you about people that they knew who had died from it? Do you know anybody who's died from it? Did that happen? Or did none of this happen? Did you shut down your business because you saw the pandemic with your own eyes, or did you shut down your business because you were told to by the government? Now, go and ask every other small business owner on the same street where your business is situated if this was also their experience. Then go and ask as many business owners as you can if they saw catastrophic viral outbreaks on their premises that forced them to close, or was there in fact no such visible signs of an outbreak? Did you all in fact just shut down your businesses because the government forced you to under the penalty of fines and prosecution? Now, just as a quick aside, I remember when there was a vomiting bug going around in an office I used to work in 10 years ago, and over the course of about a week or two, lots of people were out sick with this thing, and I was one of them. That was just a vomiting bug. But isn't COVID-19 supposed to be the new deadly Spanish flu? It's strange. I don't remember hearing a single story about any business being forced to close because staff members were symptomatic, extremely sick and incapacitated by COVID-19. I know that most SMEs were shut down because the government forced them to shut down because they claimed it was in the best interests of the public health. I've heard plenty of stories about businesses like meat processing plants being shut down because staff tested positive for COVID-19 in unreliable PCR tests, which don't prove if a staff member was actually sick or not. On the subject of testing, by getting tested, you are feeding the beast and keeping the case-demic going. More tests equals more positive PCR results, which means more cases, more scary graphs for the media to use, and therefore more justification by governments to introduce more lockdowns. The virus is apparently so deadly you have to be tested to know that you have it, and then healthy people are being told that they're sick and in need of quarantine and eventually vaccination, all the while actual sick people are being denied medical treatment for their conditions, and mental health issues and depression and suicides are soaring. What has happened to the consciousness of the general public that they can't see the absurdity and inhumanity of this situation? As you know, and as I've said before, universal basic income is also one of the many goals that the elites want to introduce under the new communist utopia of the Great Reset. This article is from The Guardian. COVID job losses lead MPs to call for trials of universal basic income. Right on cue. Large cross-party group urges government to allow councils to run pilot schemes. Yes, make a huge amount of the population unemployed and therefore state-dependent. A cross-party group of MPs has called on the government to allow councils to run universal basic income trials in response to mass unemployment triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. A letter to the councillor, Rishi Sunak, signed by more than 500 MPs, lords and local councillors, says pilot schemes are urgently needed as the pandemic unleashes widespread economic disruption and drives up redundancies at the fastest rate on record this winter. Launching a UBI would mean the state paying every adult a basic sum regardless of their income. Yeah, that sounds sustainable. That doesn't sound utopian or anything. Absolutely ridiculous. Where is this money supposed to come from? The letter says issues with the benefit system and the end of the furlough scheme mean Britain is ill-equipped to support people through the financial insecurity of the COVID recession. Almost like that was the plan all along. We must trial innovative approaches which create an income floor for everyone, allowing our families and communities to thrive. Thrive or all be equally poor? The pandemic has shown that we urgently need to strengthen our social security system. The creation of a universal basic income, UBI, a regular and unconditional cash payment to every individual in the UK could be the solution, the letter states. Universal basic income is about creating state dependency and is something that will be tied to a vaccine when the time comes. Remember, no jab, no pay in Australia, something like that.
You know, I suspect the majority of Australians will get vaccinated, and then there will be a strong public view that those who choose not to get vaccinated need to. There needs to be some sort of incentive stick, perhaps, through the current programs, including No Jab, No Pay, to make that happen. So I think that is a very reasonable interpretation of what the PM had to say today. Again, looking at specific things like not being able to go into restaurants, not being able to travel internationally, not being
Without the vaccine, normal life, or something approaching normal life, becomes virtually impossible. It doesn't need to be strictly stated as being mandatory. The government just needs to make it so that you can't go to the shops, get on public transport, hold down a job, travel, or perhaps even leave your home if you don't take the jab. Once the precedent has been set, basically by agreeing to this, people are essentially accepting that the government can declare a so-called pandemic at any time, and then, through coercion or the threat of being ostracized from society, leave you with no other choice but to take a substance into your body on a regular basis. Forced medical intervention. You will be admitting that you have no bodily autonomy. Ask yourself if you're going to take the vaccine because you're actually afraid of a virus that is less deadly than the flu, or if you're only taking it because you've become so demoralized and fearful that you wish to appease the government in the hopes that they may give you some of your freedom back. Now, this is immensely cowardly and pathetic. Appeasement of tyrants never works. Your freedoms don't come from the government. You have inalienable rights, and it's high time most people realize that. Our rights were never the government's to take away from us. Now, moving on. The following document I found on committees.parliament.uk, and it's Compulsory Vaccination for COVID-19 and Human Rights Law. And it says, Introduction and Summary. We are academics working in the areas of philosophy and law with specializations in inter alia, moral and political philosophy, biomedical ethics, health law and human rights law. Our submission pertains to compulsory COVID-19 vaccination, a requirement on individuals to undergo vaccination as a condition of release from pandemic-related restrictions on liberty, including on movement and association. In other words, if the person does not get vaccinated, they can't have their liberties back. Our evidence is forward-looking. We expect that a COVID-19 vaccine will become available in sufficient quantity to enable population-wide immunization. At that stage, the government will need to consider the means of delivery, including whether it is necessary to legislate for compulsory vaccination. We consider the human rights law dimensions of compulsory vaccination by reference to the Human Rights Act 1998 and the European Convention on Human Rights. As such, our submission primarily addresses a live issue, the second question in committee's call for evidence. What will the impact of specific measures taken by government to address the COVID-19 pandemic be on human rights in the UK? Our evidence takes the following form. 1. A discussion of the reasons why compulsory vaccination may need to be considered. 2. An overview of relevant legal provisions. 3. An examination of the human rights law compliance of compulsory vaccination. Our analysis under 3 establishes 2 parity arguments. If COVID-19 lockdown measures are compatible with human rights law, then it is arguable that compulsory vaccination is too. How did you arrive at that conclusion? Firstly, lockdowns were a total and complete and utter infringement of human rights, and they were only made possible by collectivist arguments about the so-called greater good. Even in an actual pandemic, I'd rather have the choice to quarantine or not and assess the risk to myself, and I would recommend in that situation that everybody did the same. Secondly, when someone says something like, then it is arguable that compulsory vaccination is too, the it is arguable part can always go in the opposite direction because it's basically subjective. It is also arguable that a compulsory vaccine is not compatible with any human rights law, given that it robs an individual of their right to bodily sovereignty. It's simple, okay? I'm going to break it down for you. If an individual citizen, you or I, do not have the right to restrict another human being's rights or to coerce or force a substance into their body, then neither does the state. If it is illegal for me to shove a needle in someone else's arm without their consent, then it is illegal for someone else to do it to me. End of story. Any other argument is simply justification for tyranny and oppression. It continues. B. If compulsory medical treatment under mental health law for personal and public protection purposes is compatible with human rights law, then it is arguable that compulsory vaccination is too. This kind of argument concerns me a great deal because potentially such an argument could open up justification for compulsory vaccination of someone deemed to be mentally ill because they won't take a vaccine, and that their refusal to do so makes them a public health risk. I find that kind of argument quite alarming. So it goes on. Our chief conclusion is that as and when a vaccine becomes available at scale, the government should give serious consideration to compulsory immunization as a means of reducing the impacts of COVID-19. There is an arguable case for the compatibility of compulsory vaccination with human rights law, and like I said, there's an arguable case in the opposite direction as well. Number 1. Vaccine hesitancy. A COVID-19 vaccine promises to be the best means to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic on individuals and society, yet sufficient voluntary uptake of a vaccine cannot be guaranteed. Voluntary vaccine uptake may be limited by vaccine hesitancy, which the World Health Organization describes as the reluctance or refusal to vaccinate despite the availability of vaccines. Vaccine hesitancy in respect of COVID-19 may arise because of the influence of anti-vaccination movements, the uneven demographic distribution of COVID-19 morbidity and mortality risks, or the mistaken belief that COVID-19 immunity has already been acquired. I don't know about you, but I'm picking up a slight bias in this argument. Anyway, the document is 8 pages long, and I will include it linked below for you to read in full. Now let's move on, but on the subject of vaccines, recently British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the following.
The Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has been tested on over 40,000 volunteers, and interim results suggest it is proving 90% effective at protecting people against the virus. But we haven't yet seen the full safety data, and these findings also need to be peer reviewed. So we've cleared one significant hurdle, but there are several more to go before we know the vaccine can be used.
For a vaccine to be deemed reasonably safe, it takes years, not 8 or 9 months to develop. Draw your own conclusions as to why the powers that be are so adamant that the entire population of the planet take a hastily prepared experimental RNA vaccine for a virus that doesn't warrant a vaccine because it's less deadly than a flu. If you're not massively suspicious about all of this, then you're simply not using your brain.
What I can say is that if and when this vaccine is approved, we in this country will be ready to start using it. Earlier this year, the UK government ordered 40 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, enough for about a third of the population, since you need 2 doses each.
And there you go. He just drops that in there. You need 2 doses, apparently, because even though they don't know much about this virus, not only can they develop a vaccine against it, but they also know that you need 2 doses of the vaccine. Or, as Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum said,
about the vaccine itself, we don't know yet, for example, is 1 dose sufficient? Do you need 2 doses? In what interval? Do you have even to be vaccinated every year? Because the antibodies may not sustain for a long time.
Maybe people will need to be vaccinated every year. Wow. What did humanity do for tens of thousands of years before the pharmaceutical industry came along? Did the human immune system just stop working in 2020? Now, go ahead and call me conspiratorial tinfoil hat man, but I have to wonder if all of these injections into the human body have anything to do with this.
What the fourth industrial revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities.
Probably not, right? What could be the harm? What's the worst that could happen? Let's move on. This article is from the Irish Times. Ireland to get more than 2 million doses of Pfizer COVID vaccine if approved. Public health officials have cautiously welcomed news that a vaccine being developed by Pfizer could be more than 90% effective, while airline and hotel stocks soared on announcement. National Public Health Emergency Team NPHET members described the drug giant's announcement, based on limited data from Phase 3 trials, as a good first step, but said they awaited more detailed information being published. By the way, you may have seen this letter doing the rounds on social media. It's from Broad Green International School. This is a school in Liverpool in the UK. And it says, "Dear parents, carers, As you may be aware, Liverpool is in Tier 3 COVID-19 safeguarding arrangements. As part of this process, central government has identified Liverpool to pilot a new COVID-19 testing system. This is being called the lateral flow system. Sites across the city are due to be positioned across the city in order to carry out testing. I am pleased to inform you that we at Broad Green International School are in the privileged position of being one of the first schools within the city to have the testing brought to our site. What a privilege. I have met this afternoon with representatives of the British Army who will be in the school next week to COVID-19 to test all of our students and staff. Each child and adult will be identified with a unique barcode to ensure personal identification of test and subsequent results. Results will be distributed to students and staff as soon as we are in receipt of them. If positive results are received, the school will secure the individual concerned, and in case of students inform parents' care immediately, we will then operate our usual process of identifying others who may have been in close or direct contact, for our self-isolation system will be put in place. It's not worded very well, but I think you get the point. We are currently working with public health to identify how this pilot might benefit school communities now and in the future. I'm expecting that the testing at BGIS will start on Monday 9th of November. Under normal circumstances, parental permission is sought for the testing of children. However, under these very challenging and unprecedented circumstances, that is not possible. Therefore, we would ask that if you wish to exclude your child from this test, please do so in writing to me first thing on Monday morning. It is important that the health of your child, those of other parents and carers and all adults in our school and local and wider Liverpool community, that we cooperate 100% with this system of health protection. Barcodes for children to provide personal identification and for test results, and testing is by default, so you have to write to the head teacher in order to prevent your child from being tested. You have to opt out of it. This isn't absolutely terrifying or anything. Anyway, this next article is from the Deacon Herald. Protests in Brazil support Jair Bolsonaro in anti-COVID-19 vaccine stance. Small groups of protesters gathered in Brazil's two biggest cities on Sunday to demonstrate against any mandate for the taking of a coronavirus vaccine, supporting a rejection campaign encouraged by President Jair Bolsonaro. People assembled in downtown Sao Paulo, calling for the removal of Sao Paulo State Governor João Doria, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, who has said state residents will be required to take a vaccine, likely the one being developed by Chinese biopharmaceutical company Sinovac and the local Butantan Institute. Doria will fall, the protesters chanted. Out with Doria. The Coronavac, as it is being called, has been a prime target for skepticism from Bolsonaro and others, with the president saying Brazilians will not be guinea pigs to the Chinese. The issue has become a talking point in mayoral and city council campaigns for elections later this month, and as most health professionals support vaccination, social media campaigns have raised questions about possible perils of vaccines. Now, just a reminder as to where all of this is supposed to lead us. Health passport apps on your phone that prove that you're immune and that they can also store your vaccine status, like Health Passport Ireland, and I've covered that before. This is supposed to be the means by which you can move around in society. Otherwise, I guess, you can't. As James Corbett has described this kind of thing, it's like a digital population control grid. There's also another app that's kind of similar to this, and it's for international travel. It's called Common Pass.
Common Pass is a platform that lets people safely and securely collect their health information, whether it is a negative COVID test result or eventually a record of a COVID vaccination, manage that information, control it themselves, and then be able to let that information be used to demonstrate that they have had a negative test or they have been vaccinated so they can get on an airplane or travel to another country.
Well, we can only hope that more people will connect the dots before things get very much worse. All we can do in the meantime is try to have civil conversations with friends and family who will listen, share ideas and content, and hope a reasonable amount of people come to their senses. We can't wake up everyone, maybe not even most people, but if we can just reach a sufficient number, a critical mass of the population, That could provide some decent pushback on all of this. To conclude this video, I just want to let you know that I've recently produced a discussion on some of the political themes of the film The Hunger Games on my second channel, The Dave Cullen Show. For those of you who are interested in checking out that video, the link is below in the description box and pinned to the top of the comments. Head on over there and have a look. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.